Everybody Hates Chris was a lot like its main character. Just as young Chris made his way through 1980s Bed-Stuy, the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood in Brooklyn, the show similarly faced difficulties with network and scheduling changes, and the distinction of being one of the few sitcoms on the air starring a largely black cast. It ran for 4 seasons and nearly 100 episodes, and its enduring legacy is the story of an underdog series. Everybody Hates Chris was loosely based on the childhood of comedian Chris Rock. Rock had made a name for himself as a stand-up in the 1980s, appearing in movies including Beverly Hills Cop 2, and he was also a cast member on Saturday Night Live. A series of well-received HBO stand-up comedy specials helped elevate Rock's profile in the 1990s. In 1997, he would star on The Chris Rock Show for HBO, and it was there he met writer Ali Leroy. The two would work together on the movie Head of State, though their biggest collaboration would debut on TV a few years later. The idea for this series, Everybody Hates Chris, came originally from an executive at Fox.
And they wanted to get in business with Chris, and they wanted to do kind of like a Chris Rock Wonder Years thing. So I was like, okay, that sounds interesting.
I think somebody at Fox wanted something to go after Bernie Mac, and he had kids on his show. So they're like, hey, you got Chris Rock, kid show, narration. Okay, we'll do that.
Chris Rock and Ali Leroy put together a draft for the pilot, but ultimately Fox would pass on the series. It was rumored the reason Fox passed was because they were afraid Chris Rock would eventually leave the series. In an interview, Chris Rock responded to that saying, "I don't think I've ever done anything and walked out. My name's Rock, not Chappelle." That was a reference to Dave Chappelle walking away from his TV show on Comedy Central. Ali Leroy explained the reason why he believed Fox passed on the series. Leroy said Fox's rejection was for financial, not creative reasons. Everybody Hates Chris is a single-camera comedy, which are more expensive to produce than series filmed live on a soundstage, and Fox already had several of those projects going. You can't be mad at them, he says. This all took place in the early 2000s, and the script sat around for some time before it could be taken to another network. Chris Rock said about it in an interview, "People didn't want to do it. There was nothing personal about it. They just didn't want to do it. They just didn't like the idea. Doing a show takes a lot to rev up. It's like a space shuttle mission. Every time they don't take off, it's like..." Eventually, it would make its way to Don Ostroff, the president of UPN.
Don said, "This is the best script I've seen all year. Let's do this."
The title for the series is a reference to the hit CBS series Everybody Loves Raymond. In spite of the similarities between the two names, the shows are not narratively connected. Chris Rock described his upbringing in an interview. "I grew up in a very loving two-parent household in the middle of one of the worst ghettos in New York City. I just thought everybody lived around abandoned buildings and crackheads. I lived in the ghetto until I was like 19. I came to Los Angeles and stayed at hotels and stuff. When I got back to what my neighborhood looked like, I started getting scared. A few changes needed to be made to the series before it premiered."
My actual family, I have 6 brothers and a sister. We didn't want to make a family with 7 boys and a girl. It's just a little too weird.
It's loosely based on Chris Rock, the guy. Any awkward 13-year-old kid who wasn't rich can kind of empathize.
One part of Rock's childhood that made it into the series was him being the only black kid at his school. He's quoted in an article describing it, saying, "I was so much smaller than the other guys at school, and I remember a guy one morning turning me upside down and shaking the money out of my pockets. I just hung there praying he didn't drop me on my head. I was constantly bullied, mainly for being black. I tried scrubbing, but it wouldn't come out. Even soaking, nothing happened." A wide search was held to find the actor to bring young Chris Rock to life, and eventually they found Tyler James Williams. Williams began his career early in life, appearing on Sesame Street, and he even had a brief appearance on Saturday Night Live. Young Chris would be the actor's first major role. Chris isn't what you might expect out of a young Chris Rock, as he spends less time telling jokes and more time trying to survive in all the ways the world makes it tough for a 13-year-old boy. Chris is your average kid who has below average luck, as nearly every episode ends with him getting blamed for something.
"You can ask her to be your girlfriend?"
I didn't know a lot of girls who had boyfriends. Babies, yes, but not boyfriends. I don't know, maybe.
Terry Crews was cast to be Chris's father, Julius. Originally a football player in the NFL, Crews transitioned to the world of acting in the late 90s, first appearing on the game show Battle Dome. His career got a boost appearing in a series of movies including Friday After Next, White Chicks, and a remake of The Longest Yard. He also appeared as the spokesman in a series of ads for Old Spice. The role of Julius was especially important, not just for Cruz's career, but for the show as well. Julius was the only character who shared a name with someone from Chris Rock's family, aside from Chris, of course.
Chris took notice of me. He said he noticed that I was a father. He also noticed how I was around other women or around other people, and he saw that. He was like, this dude is about his family.
Julius holds his family together by working 2 jobs and having a keen instinct to know how much just about everything costs.
Tutors are expensive. Y'all just gonna have to work harder. We can barely afford kids. We can't afford stupid kids.
Tachina Arnold was cast to play Chris's mother, Rochelle. Easily the most experienced member of the cast, Arnold had her first major role back in 1986 in the movie Little Shop of Horrors. She would have many roles afterwards, though her biggest role was when she was reunited with Tisha Campbell, who also appeared in Little Shop of Horrors, on the Fox sitcom Martin, where Arnold played Pam. Arnold's performance is often highlighted as one of the strongest on the show, and her improv on the set helped bring the character of Rochelle to life. Rochelle is a complicated woman who runs her home with an iron fist, while sometimes working odd jobs to help make ends meet. Not that she needs to.
Do I look like I have your check? All that howling at people. I don't need this. My husband has 2 jobs. I don't need to be here.
Taquan Richmond was cast as Chris's younger brother, Drew. Before getting the role of Drew, Richmond had appeared in several commercials and was in the movie Ray. Originally, Richmond had auditioned for the part of Chris, but he was just too cool for the role.
We auditioned him for the role of Chris. And the first thing that struck Chris Rock and I both was that he's too cool.
Although not a great fit for Chris, Richmond reminded them of Tony Rock, Chris's cooler younger brother. So when Tyler James Williams was cast as Chris, they realized that Taquan Richmond would be a great foil as the cooler younger brother Drew. Taller, better with the girls, and just generally more well-liked. Drew is everything that Chris isn't. And he's so chill about it that he just kind of rolls with being so great at so many things.
I could write out your homework. No, I'm fine. I never wrote with my left hand before, but it turns out I'm really good at it.
Imani Hakim was cast to play Tanya, the youngest of the family. A complete unknown, this was Hakim's first role after she came to Los Angeles with her father a few months prior. Performing with an almost effortless charm, Hakim has the ability to be incredibly sweet, but also pure evil. She often uses her pull with her parents to torment her brothers, especially Chris.
Mama said I can watch Three's Company.
We're watching the game.
I don't care.
The last member of the principal cast was Vincent Martella, who played Chris's friend Greg. Martella had appeared in a handful of roles before the series, notably in Deuce Bigalow European Gigolo. Martella was chosen because he had the look of a kid who would have grown up in Brooklyn at the time.
It came down to 2, and I think your line was, one of these kids is from Brooklyn.
Right, he seems like he's from Brooklyn.
Martella has an easy chemistry with Tyler James Williams, making him a good sidekick. As a fellow loser, Greg is Chris's best and only friend at school, though he'll absolutely leave Chris high and dry if bullies come calling.
There's got your back guys and I'll be back guys.
Greg!
Greg was I'm running like a bitch guy.
Narration for the series was done by Chris Rock. He connected stories to the present day while filling in narrative gaps. He also had a tendency to ad-lib during the record sessions, giving his narration a very distinct feel to it.
I was a bad boy years before Puff Daddy, before Martin Lawrence and Will Smith, before Biggie, before Craig Mack, before Black Rob.
In addition to the principal cast was a long list of guest stars such as Travis Flory as Joey Caruso, Jacqueline Mazzarella as Miss Morello, and Cavante Jackson as Jerome. There were also numerous faces from TV history making up the rest of Bed-Stuy, such as Ernest Thomas as Mr. Omar,
Tragic!
Antonio Fargas as Doc, and Jackée Harry as Vanessa. And I have to make a special mention of a moment between Jimmy Walker of Good Times fame and the stand-up comedian Earthquake.
I hear it all the time.
I said dynamite, he almost killed my ass. He had an episodic flashback like I never said before. I said it.
Whoa. Whoa.
I'm just joking.
Okay.
The show was filmed at Paramount Studios in Los Angeles. They were surprisingly economical with the number of locations they got from that one lot, as the series was never afraid to travel to all sorts of different parts of New York and sometimes outside of it. In addition to all the locations, they also paid special attention to small details that reflected the vibe of each area. For instance, Chris's home is always presented in warm colors, and the school is always presented in cooler ones, reflecting the warmth of one space and the hostility of another. It's a subtle way of showing the viewers that Chris is never fully safe at school. The series had a large number of cutaways, reflecting Chris's imagination getting the best of him. The number of sets, costumes, props, and actors hired for these really help underscore that this show must have had a decent-sized budget, and it was very committed to putting all that budget on screen. Not really seen, but instead heard, is the show's soundtrack. It uses a mix of pop music from the 80s with original music by Marcus Miller. And when I say by Marcus Miller, I really mean it because he not only wrote all the music, he performed many of the instruments for each piece. Miller also wrote the show's opening theme, although it had to go through numerous revisions.
I sent Ali, I think I was up to draft 8 by the time, he said it was cool. And once I got past Ali, then Chris stepped in, and said, nah, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. So it was great because we worked together and no one was afraid to, give their opinion. But in the end, it came out something everybody's happy with.
One interesting bit of history, though, is that there was another opening theme produced for the show, written and performed by Tichina Arnold and 2 of her friends.
Things get complicated. No wonder he's so hated. Everybody hates Chris.
Although it wasn't used for the opening of the series, it did serve as a stinger at the end of each episode, with a few episodes using slightly different versions. Ahead of its debut, Everybody Hates Chris was riding a big wave of hype. An article from the Wall Street Journal described it. When the TV networks screen new sitcoms for advertising executives, the response typically ranges from sporadic guffaws to polite giggles to grim silence. Very rarely do advertisers scream with laughter as they did last week when they saw Everybody Hates Chris. Everybody Hates Chris would be given a spot on Thursday nights, one of the most lucrative nights for television. It debuted on September 22nd, 2005, with its first episode titled Everybody Hates the Pilot. The first episode of Everybody Hates Chris, in standard pilot form, establishes the premise, characters, and environment Chris finds himself in. He's the oldest of 3 kids, his family is poor, he's growing up in Bed-Stuy, and he's the only black kid at an all-white school. The show also introduces us to one of its unique style conventions by showing off one of its fantasy sequences in the first 15 seconds of the episode. Rochelle explains that Chris is going to an all-white school because she assumes he'll get a better education.
The junior high school around here is like a hoodlum factory. Now those white kids, they get an education.
Not a Harvard-type education, just a not sticking up a liquor store type education.
What this helps establish is the rules that Chris is being presented with, that by working hard at school, he has the opportunity to make more of his life than his parents have. Only getting to school requires multiple bus rides, facing down bullies, and trying to hold up his responsibilities as the oldest child of the family. It's a lot to put on the shoulders of a 13-year-old boy. You get a sense of the precariousness of Chris's life when he accidentally eats the big piece of chicken reserved for his father.
She didn't want him to go to work hungry, because if he goes to work hungry, then he'll be grouchy. And if he's grouchy, he might call his boss Cracker. And if he calls his boss Cracker, then we're living in the projects again.
It's not just discipline for discipline's sake, but that Chris's parents have to be tough on him because they want a better life for him. And it reflects what it's like to grow up poor, knowing you need to work harder than everyone else, having to struggle towards that end as a family, and doing it all so that you can one day afford a full meal for everyone. Chris goes through a lot of rough stuff. He's yelled at by his mom, beaten up at school, called a racial slur, and run ragged from a long day. But because of all that hardship, the sweetness feels a little bit truer. Chris Rock and Ali Leroy discuss it on the DVD audio commentary for the pilot.
The heart and love doesn't seem so corny.
Right, because you actually balance it against really bad stuff.
Yeah, right.
Look
Even
at this.
this.
Tanks, dogs.
Tanks, dogs.
That really encapsulates why Everybody Hates Chris works compared to other sitcoms that come across as cheesy or overly sentimental. It goes so hard on its main character that any kind of sweetness feels like relief. He's just a kid, and he deserves a bit of that sweetness every now and again, because as the title of the show makes clear, he's in for a lot of rough stuff over the next 4 seasons. Everybody Hates Chris is about how Chris the boy becomes Chris Rock the man. And I'm going to avoid using Chris's last name unless I'm talking about the comedian Chris Rock, because oddly enough, they never really use his last name on the show. This is not a biography about Chris Rock and how he embraced a life of comedy. Rather, it's the broader story of Chris, the oldest child in his family, confronting the realities of adulthood. For example, when Rochelle's father dies, Chris picks up the slack by filling in for her around the house.
Can
not mess down. You trying to make everyone in the house deaf? Take your feet off the table.
For Father's Day, Chris gets Julius the one thing he wants: help with the bills.
This is the best gift I ever got. I'll remember this forever.
Happy Father's Day.
It might be a good idea if you get a job and start paying a bill every month.
Chris also does other things you would more typically see in sitcoms, like getting a job or learning how to drive. But I wanted to highlight these other two examples because it's something that this show does that's a little different from those other sitcoms. Chris's growth here isn't just taking on more responsibilities, but learning to understand his parents as more complex individuals. By stepping into their shoes, picking up the slack for Rochelle, and paying a bill for Julius, Chris is doing more than lending a hand. He's starting to understand the sacrifices his parents have made to keep their family going. Seeing his parents as more three-dimensional people is a big part of Chris's journey into adulthood. When Chris is having trouble learning algebra, he at first goes to his mother for help, since she's so good with numbers. But when he struggles to learn from her, he instead goes to his grandmother, played by Loretta Devine.
You are impatient. You couldn't teach a rock how to hit the ground if you dropped it.
Now all you gotta do is fall straight down.
Didn't I tell you to hit the ground?
Rochelle is upset to find out Chris can't learn from her, and the resolution sees Chris having a talk with his mother to help her deal with her hurt feelings.
The way you were teaching me, I couldn't get it.
Well, I was doing the best I could.
I know, and that's okay, because there's a lot of other things I learned from you.
It's an interesting version of the classic sitcom trope of the parent having to sit down for a heart-to-heart conversation with the child. And it does this without making Rochelle act like a child. She's still a mother trying her best. She's just feeling insecure that she can't give her son everything he needs. And Chris wants to remind her that she still gives him a lot. The parent-child dynamic isn't completely done away with either. As we see in one of the last episodes of the series, Chris saying no to Rochelle is a major moment.
No.
What?
This episode highlights what the series is trying to get across with these parent-child relationships, that they're being renegotiated as Chris grows older. And Rochelle needs to learn that she needs to explain why she's asking Chris to do something instead of just expecting him to do it, even if he thinks it's unfair.
If I want him to do something that I don't want the other kids to do, I probably have a good reason.
And do you have a good reason?
No. But that doesn't matter.
The relationship between the two seemingly evolves, although the episode does end with Julius taking Rochelle's place.
Drew and Tanya, go watch TV. Chris, clean this mess up.
Yeah, baby.
This highlights an internal change here for Chris, something he suspected, but he now can confirm is true. Sometimes his parents are more interested in asserting their authority than being just and fair. In both of these situations, Chris is learning how to be more of his own individual, offering concern for the feelings of his parents, but also understanding that they're flawed people who don't have the final say in his life. After Chris's defiant no to Rochelle, the series would end a few episodes later, but it's interesting to think about where the show might have gone as Chris moved further into adulthood. The only real suggestion of where he's going is that he's going to be making more decisions for himself, and hopefully in a way that respects the people around him. Chris Rock had a cameo on the series in its third season, playing young Chris's guidance counselor.
When you get out of high school, take some time to figure things out. Get a job, travel. Go find yourself.
The image of Chris Rock telling his younger self to find himself is very weighty. And I think this moment is less about Chris Rock reflecting on his life and instead delivering a broader message to the audience. We all know Chris's eventual path is to become a famous comedian, but it's not that becoming a comedian is the answer, but rather finding a place in the world where you can excel at what you do best. And to do that, you need to know who you are first. The episode ends with Chris realizing he already has a positive role model.
At that moment, I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do, but what I wanted to be was just like my father.
It doesn't really answer the question of what Chris wants to do with his future, but it provides some clarity to the type of person he wants to be. As a young teenager, that's all he really needs for the time being. While Chris Rock's future isn't emphasized much, we do get a hefty dose of the decade he grew up in. Everybody Hates Chris is unmistakably set in the 1980s. One of the few good reputations that Chris has in his neighborhood is that he's the best at asteroids.
I was also known for being the best asteroid player in Bed-Stuy.
When Chris wants to make a little extra money, he does so by becoming a DJ. And when Christmas time rolls around, what Chris wants most is a Walkman.
Having a Walkman meant you could even listen to bad music, and nobody had to know.
These cultural artifacts are dressings for deeper lessons about growing up, like Chris not getting that Walkman because his family can't afford it.
Well, you're not getting a present for Christmas.
He said that like we're out of bacon.
The choice to be set in the 80s is a little strange when you consider that Chris Rock was 17 in 1982 and not 13 like he is in the series. And an interesting note about the production is that the costumes were taken from what fashion looked like on television at the time.
A lot of the research was just trying to remember what you had seen when you were a kid on television.
All of this raises the question of what period pieces are even supposed to be. And when artistic liberties are taken, are they meant to reflect a certain era or instead commenting more on how we in the present day remember those eras? In the case of Everybody Hates Chris, I think it's very much the latter. And it constantly reminds us how our modern sympathies color our understanding of the past, and quite possibly the present as well, trapping us into these assumptions we make about certain people and communities. A great example of this is Drew being a huge fan of Wayne Gretzky and hockey more broadly.
What do you think? Drew thought about saying this.
Gretzky? It's not Gretzky, it's Gretzky with an E. I scored 100 on my spelling test. I can't wear this.
There's a neat cameo in a later episode where we see Willie O'Ree, the first black player in the NHL, make an appearance.
We must be the only 3 black hockey fans in New York.
I'm not a hockey fan.
Well, I guess it's just us then.
And the show doesn't shy away from showing how one of the barriers between a sport and a community can be racist gatekeepers.
Don't you guys got enough sports? Basketball, football, baseball, boxing, track and field. You gotta take hockey too, huh?
Of course, one of the biggest barriers to playing hockey at a young age is the enormous cost and lack of programs for young people in marginalized communities. But that's another part of the story. Drew enjoys all sports, but hockey in particular seems unusual for a black kid growing up in Brooklyn. But Wayne Gretzky was massively popular back in the 80s, so it really isn't that unthinkable that a kid who loves sports might also be a fan of one of the greatest hockey players who ever lived. Moments like these not only try to undermine stereotypes in the present, that someone like Drew would probably not be into hockey, but that this is something that could have always been true if we took the time to broaden our understanding of people beyond stereotypes. Everybody Hates Chris is trying to complicate our understanding of a story set in the 1980s by giving us a more sophisticated look at interpersonal dynamics and portraying a version of history that both accentuates and minimizes storytelling cliches from that era, instead asking us to accept a messier way of remembering. And by doing so, we have the opportunity to see how those memories manifest in the present day. There are probably a lot of kids just like Drew who enjoy watching hockey, and there have always been kids like that. And if that comes as a surprise, the show is creating an opportunity for us to think about why that's surprising, and whether it's a reflection of what we know or what we assume about certain people. Chris Rock's story has become Chris's story, and so we have a fictionalized past speaking to people over 20 years later. None of it is meant to be biographical or historical. Rather, it's this heightened sense of how we understand all of it, about the constructed nature of society, history, and biographies, what we emphasize and how we emphasize it, and how that often says more about our present sensibilities than any deeper understanding of the past. It's impossible not to notice that Chris's family is poor.
That's 49 cents of spilt milk dripping all over my table. Somebody gonna drink this milk.
But it's more than Julius's penny counting that shows us the family's poverty. Numerous plot lines revolve around Chris or someone in his family not being able to afford something or doing something unusual for money, like driving a guy to Las Vegas unaware that he's a criminal.
Here you go, officer. I know you need to take this in as evidence.
Freeze. You're under arrest.
No, they need to take you in as evidence.
Not that a guy being a criminal is all that unusual in Bed-Stuy. Chris lives in a community filled with crime to the point where Rochelle runs into someone she knows when she and Julius are robbed on a rare night out.
Ricky Edwards? Donna's brother.
Yeah, how you been?
Oh, good till now. How you been?
Oh, I'm hanging in there.
All right, okay.
One of the consequences of making crime such a regular part of the show's fabric is that it made it tougher to do the classic, very special episode of a sitcom. Terry Crews explained in the audio commentary.
There will never be a very special episode of Everybody Hates Chris. You get robbed, and it's no big deal.
Rochelle running into an old friend isn't an anomaly either, as criminals become part of the series' wider cast of characters, like Chris's regular robber Jerome.
Why don't you let me hold it down?
In case you didn't know, when a criminal says, "Let me hold something," that means you're never getting it back. Let me hold your cash register.
Chris also gets robbed by the recurring character Malvo, played by the late Ricky Harris.
And you better not tell nobody you just got robbed by Malvo.
And less of a threat to Chris and his family is Risky, played by Mike Estemy.
Now, if you want to buy Bill cigarettes, that's one thing. A Playboy magazine? You better keep on moving. Tell your mama I say hey.
This was part of a larger philosophy of the show, expanding the circle of people we know, in this case Chris's family, to include an entire community.
It kind of look at the show kind of like The Simpsons. And, you know, the more characters that you flush out, you know, the easier it'll get. So we just felt the need to really flush out some more characters.
A lot of shows have tried to do this, but in Everybody Hates Chris, the cast very much reflects the poor neighborhood of Bed-Stuy. They act as a recurring resource for the show, pulling on its rich cast of characters whenever it wants jokes that wouldn't really work coming from the principal cast. But more than that, it makes the characters feel like they live in a real community, and one that's filled with characters struggling alongside Chris and his family. And in spite of the examples I gave earlier, most of them don't resort to a life of robbery. One of the kinder residents is Doc, Chris's boss. The job he offers Chris pays him under the table, and he offers lots of great advice, a place for Chris to focus on his schoolwork when things are slow, and the chance to make some connections around the neighborhood.
Doc, listen, I come in on time and I never leave early. I work hard, so I deserve minimum wage.
And while this could be a story about workers' rights, it hits a little different when it's an old man trying to keep his only source of income afloat. Him paying Chris with all those other benefits, as opposed to the lower paying and far more demanding job he had at a Chinese restaurant, at least does something to compensate for being paid below minimum wage. And also, he is in fact making more money, since his take-home pay is higher when he's not being taxed.
If I paid you minimum wage, you'd get taxed and I'd get taxed. I'd have to get unemployment insurance, workman's compensation, and their child labor laws.
The real solution, of course, is uplifting communities so local businesses can afford to pay all workers a livable wage, but that wasn't such an easy option in Bed-Stuy in 1986. Kill Moves, played by Jarvis Poindexter, is another example of a struggling resident of Bed-Stuy.
One ball pop, $2. Sell you a lick for a nickel.
Kill Moves is actually from a very wealthy family, but had a breakdown and now lives on the street. He's a very complicated character in that respect and could probably fill an entire video essay about how the show grapples with mental health and being unhoused. But I want to highlight Kill Moves because he's not only given the space to be a multifaceted character, but also represents a portion of the population most people would rather ignore. And importantly, as scary as an unhoused person with mental health issues might be considered, Kill Moves is presented often as a pretty good guy, probably because the people around him treat him like a human being and not an invisible man. One of the things that makes the community of Bed-Stuy feel so interconnected is how all of these characters are struggling, and in turn they have to rely on one another. It creates a real sense of community, including members that are more often forgotten or ignored, such as Kill Moves. Even Jerome and Malvo have the opportunity to grow, and at one point Malvo even tries to reform his life.
He needs classroom experience. It'll help him get acclimated.
Acclimated to a custom or to become accustomed to a new climate or an environment.
The show really emphasizes that living in Bed-Stuy isn't just a place where your house is. It's a community you're a part of. And you may not choose the people in that community, and some of them might do terrible things, but you still form a relationship with everyone because you're all sharing the same experience, in this case, living in a low-income neighborhood. Hardship can help build community, and while people shouldn't require hardship to do that, the fact that it's happening on this show, I think is meant to show us how we can better understand poorer communities, how they build strength from their internal structures and members. The experience of living in Bed-Stuy has an interesting parallel seen in the episode Everybody Hates Blackie. Blackie is a dog, by the way. When Chris finds out Blackie responds to Spanish, he goes to a Puerto Rican neighborhood for some help.
I learned about a whole new world. A world that ironically wasn't too different than the world I already knew.
While he's there, Chris finds out there's a Puerto Rican version of everyone in his neighborhood.
There was even a Puerto Rican Jerome. Hey, papi la otra calle.
It really shows that Bed-Stuy isn't a unique or specifically Black experience, but rather something all poor communities would be able to relate to. The only real difference for Chris is that the Puerto Rican girls seem to like him a lot more, but that might just have been because of the dog. Everybody Hates Chris's first season had a strong critical reception and very good early ratings. It was the second most popular show on UPN, only behind America's Next Top Model, though it would face a real challenge ahead of its second season when UPN and rival channel WB merged to form the CW. Everybody Hates Chris was bumped out of its usual Thursday evening time slot and moved to Sunday night at 7 p.m., and then 2 weeks later to Monday night at 8 p.m. Its third season saw another switch back to Sunday at 8 p.m., and then finally it was moved to Friday night at 8 p.m. for its fourth season. A network change is bad enough, but all these time slot changes made things even more difficult for the show, and it never reached the heights its ratings had found in its first season. A New York Times article described the situation. The show's October 1st season premiere showed that it had slipped 72% among viewers 18 to 49. It was seen by 2.44 million viewers in total from its debut last season, its worst showing to date except for reruns. This month, the show was moved to Monday nights, along with 3 other comedy shows, All of Us, Girlfriends, and The Game. Ratings on October 16th surged to 3 million viewers, and the show had 3.19 million viewers for the October 23rd episode, according to Nielsen Media Research. Although the article describes it as a surge, it's easy to infer that the show didn't recapture the additional 72% of viewers it had for its first season. In addition to its rating woes, there was also a kind of discourse that hung over the show as well. From the month it aired, it immediately invited a certain comparison. Here's an article from that time period. The Cosby Show parallels, much as Rock wants to dismiss them, are hard to ignore. In the fall of 1984, the sitcom had been given its last rites. The classics of the 70s like All in the Family and MASH were gone, and the only comedy to crack the Nielsen Top 10 the previous year was Kate and Ally. Soaps and action dramas were the future, we were told, until Cosby's little comedy about an African-American family in Brooklyn became the biggest hit of the decade. 21 years later, the sitcom's headed for another autopsy. The classic of the 90s like Seinfeld and Frasier and Everybody Loves Raymond are gone. Now here comes Rock with another comedy about an African-American family in Brooklyn, and expectations are through the roof, even though most TV viewers may think UPN is a shipping company. As a sitcom about a family with a predominantly black cast, Everybody Hates Chris inevitably got compared to The Cosby Show. This was before the truth about Bill Cosby was more widely known, and The Cosby Show remains one of the most popular sitcoms of all time, so it's clearly meant as a compliment. But Everybody Hates Chris is a very different kind of show. In many of the comments coming from people who worked on the series, they kept emphasizing that distinction. This is Ali Leroy talking on NPR.
This show even exists in the same era that the Bill Cosby Show of the 80s, that great Bill Cosby Show. These people lived across town.
And here's an article from the New York Times. Everybody Hates Chris represents a return to showing ordinary folk finding their way, Terry Crews said. After The Cosby Show, which ran from 1984 to 92, featuring an affluent black family, everybody had to be making money, he said. The pendulum swings the other way to our show. The heart is not what we do, but who we are, like 95% of the world. More than the class differences, Chris's family is far more chaotic and combative. The jokes are much bolder, and the storylines have a heightened sense to them. And perhaps most obviously, Everybody Hates Chris was never squeamish about discussing race the way The Cosby Show had been. In fact, the only real similarity between the two is that they're sitcoms featuring a black family living in Brooklyn in the 1980s. Even this isn't very accurate, though, because Chris's family live in a completely different part of town, and Everybody Hates Chris is a flashback, where The Cosby Show was contemporary. The show itself did occasionally play into that comparison, particularly in the later seasons. The third season featured a guest appearance by Felicia Rashad in the episode Everybody Hates Kwanzaa. She played Kilmoose' affluent mother and helped provide a bold political statement about how her eccentric son ended up living on the street.
Until a few years ago, he was functioning semi-normally as an air traffic controller.
What happened?
Ronald Reagan. He fired us all. That sent me on a downward spiral of paranoia, schizophrenia.
Reagan, too.
In a behind-the-scenes featurette, Felicia Rashad was happy to make the comparison between Everybody Hates Chris and The Cosby Show.
It's great family entertainment, just like The Cosby Show was. I like it so much when I'm flying, I watch every episode they have on the plane.
The show leaned even harder on the comparison in the season 4 episode, Everybody Hates Homecoming, where Chris wants to go to a dance with a girl named Janice, played by Tristan Mays. But he has to impress her parents, Dr. Clint Huxtable, played by Orlando Jordan, and Blair Huxtable, played by Devika Parikh. The characters' names are obviously a reference to Denise, Cliff, and Claire Huxtable.
What does your father do?
Oh, he has 2 jobs.
Oh, so he's a doctor and a lawyer.
No, he drives a truck and the security part-time.
I see. Much like your people from Bed-Stuy, our daughter here is screw up. Yeah.
Chris's world in this series is filled with pop culture references, but never once is The Cosby Show mentioned by name. It only appears here as a gag for viewers watching at home to show just how different the two shows were. And Chris's world is still one where Bill Cosby exists. He even gets referenced a few episodes later in the same season.
What's this called?
Leonard Part 5, Nipsey Russell's best movie. They're doing a sequel with Bill Cosby.
What all this, I think, speaks to most clearly is not the dueling realities of these two shows, but rather how we trap a show like Everybody Hates Chris into a box because it has a black cast. It's no longer just a family sitcom, it has to be a black family sitcom. And with that label comes the inevitable comparisons to other black family sitcoms. Even though it probably has more in common with The Wonder Years than Family Matters, its lineage is myopically connected to shows on a superficial level. This can sometimes cut in a positive way, such as getting a high-profile guest star like Whoopi Goldberg, who appeared in the show's second season.
If she wasn't so damn evil, nobody'd be trying to hit her over the head.
Excuse me.
You're excused.
But more often than not, it kept the show in this critical bubble where it had to be viewed not as one show among many, but one out of a specific subset. While Everybody Hates Chris does reference race, something that shows with black casts more typically do, perhaps this should be seen as a reflection on how shows with white casts often ignore one of the major subjects for conversation happening in society today. There is another side of this argument that I think needs to be considered, and why this concern over the black family sitcom comes from a different place as well. Here's an excerpt from an article from 2009, shortly before the show came to an end. In 1997, the broadcast networks offered 15 black comedies, albeit mostly on the now-defunct WB and UPN, which relied on the genre to carve out an audience. Today, that number is down to 2. Everybody Hates Chris and The Game. They air on the smallest network, the CW, where they have been banished to the dead zone known as Friday nights. In addition, basic cable station TBS offers a pair of black sitcoms, House of Pain and Meet the Browns, both from Tyler Perry. The reason Everybody Hates Chris felt exceptional is because it absolutely was. And with that in mind, I think it explains why people imbued it with this sense of hope and optimism for changing the TV landscape the way The Cosby Show had. Not because the two shows were all that similar, but because they spoke to the same desire to see more diversity in the world of sitcoms. After The Cosby Show, there was a huge influx of sitcoms featuring black families and characters, but as the years wore on, we saw a gradual swing back towards predominantly white casts, especially looking at some of the more popular shows of that era. I think a better way of looking at Everybody Hates Chris is not its relationship to other black family sitcoms, but its broader place in the television landscape, and how diversity on the screen is not something that ebbs and flows like the tides, but rather is a reflection of people who make conscious decisions of what shows to put on the air and what shows not to put on the air. After all, Everybody Hates Chris had an opportunity to be on a major network like Fox, but had been passed over. Had it aired on Fox, it might have had a very different life on the air. What shows get on the air and what type of casts they have is a product of not just market trends, but people who make certain decisions. An article in the Los Angeles Times had an interesting stat that spoke clearly to how these changes happen. A survey conducted by the Directors Guild of America of more than 2,600 television episodes from 170 scripted TV series for the 2010 to 11 season found that white males directed 77% of all episodes, and white females directed 11% of all episodes. Minority males directed 11% of all episodes, and minority females directed just 1% of the shows, according to the DGA survey. Sitcoms are created by a lot of people, and this article highlights stats on the production level, but the executive level is similarly very white. And while I wouldn't assume it's just a bunch of racists running everything, I can't help but notice that whenever I research shows like these, creative decisions come down to pressure from the network to make a show more mainstream. In other words, make it more appealing to a white audience, which often means hiring more directors, actors, and other creative talent who also happen to be white. In its own small way, Everybody Hates Chris pushed back on that kind of ethos by having a lot of diversity behind the camera as well as in front of it. Aside from its creators being Chris Rock and Ali Leroy, there were numerous black directors and writers working on the show. And one of the more interesting choices for a director was Debbie Allen, who directed several episodes of the series. She famously turned the sitcom A Different World into its own well-loved show instead of its original identity as a generic spin-off of The Cosby Show. Not only did the numerous Black creative people help the show's authenticity, it also reflects the work required to broaden the creative field behind the camera, as people from different communities create different opportunities to tell stories, not just to capitalize on trends created by popular shows, but to allow more creative voices to have the opportunity to tell those stories. The two figures that loom the largest in Chris's life are his parents, Julius and Rochelle. From the beginning, they were not meant to be sitcom cliches.
It's not a show where the kids are smarter than the parents. And we're keeping it that way.
Julius, in particular, is often highlighted as a positive father figure, working 2 jobs and occasionally dispensing some fatherly wisdom.
I was listening to that.
I've heard it. The baby's not his.
Got that right.
I was the force that held the whole family together. Right. And I was like, yo, the voice of reason.
There's a lot to like about Julius, but his commitment to his family is probably at the top of that list. As an example, when he finally gets a new job at a fish market, one that pays him well enough that he only needs that one job, and it even includes some benefits, it comes with the drawback of making him stink like fish.
Are you gonna come home smelling like this every day? My God!
Eventually, he gives up the fish market for the sake of his family, and he's back to working 2 jobs. It's a considerate move and something that's very characteristic of Julius. The show may be called Everybody Hates Chris, but it could have been called Everybody Loves Julius. Rochelle is not quite so beloved. Her more abrasive personality and harsher tone made her a lot less lovable.
White mothers, Latino mothers, Asian mothers that come to me and say, oh my God, I do the exact same thing with my kids. So it's really universal.
As an example of how tough Rochelle can be, in the episode where Chris is tasked with taking care of an egg as if it were a child, she refuses to let him cut corners on his schoolwork.
My mother decided to make sure I got the full baby experience, so I didn't bring home a real one.
Chris, wake up. The baby's crying. What's wrong? You got to change his diaper.
When Chris eventually misplaces the egg, Rochelle reveals she found it and uses it to teach him a lesson about responsibility. It's a great example of how Rochelle expects so much from her kids, especially Chris, with the hope that they'll be able to do better with their lives. That love is a lot less easier to see during other parts of the show, such as the moment from this same episode when she finds out Drew has been messing with Tanya.
Stop telling your sister all that food and go get my belt.
Good thing it was Drew getting a beating and not my egg.
This is one of many jokes where Rochelle either threatens or outright hits her children. While her harshness can at least be understood as her wanting her kids to do better, and it's often tempered with some kindness, there's no excuse for ever hitting a child. What's probably most disturbing is how the show always plays it as a joke.
After my mother got through with me, Tanya, and Mr. Omar, I realized that having privacy and being independent isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Rochelle is beating her kids so regularly that in one episode she injures herself doing it.
There are various techniques that you can use to avoid injury while delivering an asshole. There's the 2-cheek cross, the roundhouse booty buster, or my personal favorite, the Kunta Kinte wheel breaker. In the wrong hands, a beating can be called child abuse. But in the right hands, it can be the difference between raising a Bill Gates or a Bobby Brown.
There is no right way to beat a child. That this show takes place in the 1980s, when violence against kids was more common, doesn't make it okay. And while I understand the impulse to make light of something painful, it's done so frequently and casually that there doesn't seem to be any consideration that this is abuse. Rochelle's general attitude is meant to reflect the immense pressure put on mothers in poor communities, doing whatever they can to keep their kids on the right path, and physical violence was a shortcut for instilling discipline. But there's something grotesque about that assumption, and it would have served the show better to demonstrate how Rochelle, as a put-upon mother, sometimes made the wrong choices out of the few that were available to her. Another complaint that is often placed on Rochelle is that she's constantly quitting her jobs because Julius has too, presenting her as lazy and entitled, as if raising 3 children was just something she did for fun. I think this criticism is a little unfair. And I think Julius in some ways gets off a little easy because it's easy to seem like a good loving parent because he's rarely around the kids and he constantly spoils Tanya, so he isn't the one who's disciplining them when they do something wrong. He always gets to be the good guy. Perhaps it would have been easier if they both had one job apiece, but they have this old-fashioned gendered dynamic where the man is expected to do the work while the woman takes care of the home. Only in this case, Rochelle seems more likely to get the hate for upholding this dynamic than Julius. Rochelle is put in the same box so many women in television are, mothers specifically, of being these horrible tyrants. Some of that criticism is unfair. However, when her harsh behavior crosses over into the world of abuse, it can't be defended any further, and a very firm line needs to be drawn. Making things even more complicated is that there's this weird racial undercurrent that doesn't sit right with me when it comes to this character. When I compare Rochelle to other mothers of working class family sitcoms, there's a lot less leeway for physical violence coming from those mothers. When depicting a black mother in a poor family, it's taken for granted that they're more likely to be violent. And underlying that are the racist assumptions that black women are less nurturing or black children more unruly. Rochelle is a very complicated character, and she can be looked at so many angles it's difficult to really have a firm grasp on how we place her in the series sometimes. Even when their parenting choices aren't good ones, the show does give us what is otherwise a happy, loving family, and I do think it's important to at least acknowledge this fact within the series. Julius and Rochelle love one another sincerely, and their marriage has some sweetness to it. As one article described it, while a number of television shows have put more affluent black characters on the small screen, Rochelle and Julius's love was symbolic of the unbreakable bond between black husbands and their wives, regardless of their circumstances. There's no doubt that Rochelle and Julius love their kids too, and there are so many episodes where they provide positive care and support. Their limitations, such as Julius's absence and Rochelle's violence, reflect the challenges of having a family when it's a struggle to afford the basic necessities, and you're stuck burning the candle at both ends trying to make it all work. This doesn't excuse any of that behavior, but at least it helps us understand why it's happening in the first place. Chris's time at school brought him into a broader world outside of his Bed-Stuy neighborhood, one that was largely dominated by white people. And with that came the reality of racism. The commentary on race on the show was never subtle, such as when Chris first starts going to Corleone Junior High. The basketball coach immediately makes an assumption about him.
All I did was throw away a piece of trash. But because I was black, here's what the coach saw.
Chris is terrible at sports. Usually the assumptions were more negative, though. Here are some coming from Chris's school principal, Dr. Raymond, played by Jude Chicolilla.
Just because you don't have a father.
But I do have a father.
Well, when your mother's on drugs.
My mom's not on drugs.
I understand, but being born a crack baby is no excuse.
I wasn't born a crack baby.
Racism laden throughout so much of the series is something you wouldn't regularly see on most sitcoms, though it's made more palatable, I suspect, because of the exaggerated world the series takes place in and the fact that it's set in the past, making it easier to pretend as though moments like these are relics of an earlier era. The heightened element of it manifests itself in some strange ways. Chris's regular bully, Caruso, always has the most inventive insults.
Because if I'm not on that bus to DC, I want a freedom march all over your face. What's the matter, McAdoo? Thought you were the only one who knew how to balance a ticket?
What's the matter, Sir Nose? Can't catch the rhythm of the stroke?
I've never seen a bully who's so well-versed in black culture that he has a new reference every time he runs into Chris. This makes his racist bullying a lot less disgusting than it might have been because half the time you're not even sure where he's pulling a reference from. Caruso's dialogue also reflects how the show spoke to more than one audience. In an audio commentary for one of the episodes, Tichina Arnold explains.
Well, you know, our show, we always have white and black jokes.
That's right.
It's just a given.
It goes all across the board.
The show has another interesting look at racism through the character of Miss Morello, Chris's racist teacher. Well, the racist teacher we see most frequently anyway. Miss Morello has a certain way of talking to Chris.
I bought you something. It's a copy of Roots 4, Kunta's Revenge. Do you know what goals are, Chris?
Yeah, I have a father.
Oh, I know, Chris. If only your mom knew his name.
Miss Morello is a special kind of racist. The type that tries to be kind, but because they bought into stereotypes about the black community, instead come off as paternalistic and ignorant. Ali Leroy explains in one of the audio commentaries.
She's a, how do we call her? She's liberal. She's one of those famous liberal racists.
Miss Morello doesn't hate black people. In fact, she's very much into black men. The way Miss Morello looks at black people may not be with the hatred of other more hostile racist characters, but she places them in a similar box, one filled with racist stereotypes that consistently limit their ability to be more than caricatures in her eyes. In the case of the random guy she's dating, it'll probably just mean their romance is doomed to fail. But for Chris, when his teacher sees him as lesser than other students, even with the desire to help to do more, it creates a limitation to everything he can achieve. In the 4th season, when Chris starts high school, there's an interesting episode where he finds out that Miss Morello, Tattaglia High School's new principal, has placed him in an all-white class, even though this school is far more diverse than his first one. Thurman, the teacher, is played by Paul Ben-Victor.
You don't belong in here.
Why not?
You're black, you're the black guy.
I took a wrong turn and ended up in South Africa.
The lesson Chris ends up learning is that he had things better in the white classroom rather than one of the more diverse ones.
See, if we're gonna be working together, why should I avoid you? So whatever you got, bring it. Might as well get used to it.
Translation, you might not like me, but those other guys tried to kill me.
The options for Chris are either stay in an unsafe homeroom or go to one with a racist teacher. He opts for the racist teacher so that he might have a shot at getting a good education. What the show only hints at is the structural issues that limit Chris's choices, that there are classes at this high school that have become completely uncontrollable, and the only safe places for learning are all-white classrooms. A space only accessible to Chris because he has a connection to the racist principal, and even then, he still has to deal with racism coming from his teacher. And as we'll see in the finale of the series, numerous other systemic barriers will keep him from getting that high-quality education. Although most of the obvious racism in the show comes from people like Caruso and Miss Morello, there's always this undercurrent of systemic racism that Chris has to fight against. While it might have been better if the show had highlighted it more clearly, as I suspect certain audience members might not have been able to catch it, its presence is still very much there. Not every white person Chris met was racist. His best friend Greg got along well with him, but the show frequently reminded us how they came from different worlds. In the episode Everybody Hates House Guests, Greg stays with Chris's family and he's surprised to hear about what their lives are like.
Work. It's nighttime.
He works at night.
And days. My dad has 2 jobs.
Make that 3.
Wow. When do you sleep?
Hey, that's a good one.
He learns how long it takes Chris to get to school. He sees how little time Chris has for homework, and he learns how Chris has to deal with crime, although Greg sees it as a novelty.
Hey, I just got a nickname. Hey, you just got robbed. Cool.
Chris grows increasingly frustrated as Greg seems to have it so much easier than him, and the two have a moment where they share their respective struggles. In the scene, Greg is dressed up like Robin because he role-plays when he says his prayers so God doesn't get bored with him.
So you live in Bed-Stuy. It takes you 3 hours to get to school, and you have an after-school job. So what? I wish I had someone to fight over the TV or bathroom with. The last thing my mother cooked on the stove got her a year of probation. I don't do everything on my own because I want to. I do it because I have to.
There's a slight temptation to read this as the struggles Chris faces not being unique, that everyone has challenges to overcome, so maybe things aren't as bad as Chris imagines. And Chris's own reaction to be grateful for having the family Greg doesn't nearly speaks to that. We all have our own personal trials after all. And while this is all true, not all of Chris's trials are personal. A lack of access to a quality education, at least compared to Greg, is something Chris's entire community faces. Having to work is another challenge for Chris, growing up poor. Greg's difficulties are real, but there's a clear difference between their two lives. And the real lesson, at least for the Chris and Greg dynamic, is that even if Chris may have that additional challenge of systemic racism to overcome, friendship shouldn't be contingent on relative levels of suffering, rather by acknowledging and supporting friends through the hard times in their lives. Everybody Hates Chris didn't just look at discrimination through the lens of white and black characters, though, although that was certainly its primary concern. When it came to discussing other groups, it sometimes struggled to get past ugly stereotypes, such as an episode where Chris is worried he might get sent to a remedial class, and we get a short bus joke. But the show did have significantly better moments. In the very next episode, we see Chris talk stereotypes with the new kid, Bernard, played by Marcel Lamb.
So I can't use chopsticks. I don't like watermelon. I can't make a swan out of paper. I don't have sickle cell anemia. I don't own a dry cleaners.
I bet you like rice.
And in the 4th season, we met Angel, played by Hector Garcia, a gender non-conforming student.
I'm terrible in the kitchen.
So?
I saw you looking at Maria. All I'm saying is that if you help me, I can help you.
We even find out Greg has a trans aunt.
You know, Patricia was in jail? Yeah, but that was when she was still my Uncle Pat. Trust me, dude. You do not want to snitch.
I'm not sure the dead naming was necessary, but it's kind of neat that it's just part of their world. And that was one thing the series really seemed to be moving towards in its later seasons. New York City is a pretty diverse place, and as Chris was getting older, he was stepping into that more complicated world. It's just a shame we never got to see him explore more of it. Looking back at Chris's time at school, there's this desire in the show to excuse some of the harsher elements. The depiction of racism are cartoony, yes, but they have an element of truth to them, specifically because we know that at least some of it is based on the life of Chris Rock. There's an interesting difference between how Rock would talk about his time at school while the show was on the air and how he discussed it years later. Here's a typical response from an article while the show was on the air. He says he's not bitter, though, about the bullying or the bigots he knew growing up. "I'm making out all right," he says. "Now, I feel sorry for them." Contrast that to some of the comments he made in 2020.
And I think I've dealt with it because I can write jokes about it, but I never dealt with it. That was just a horrible existence. I was a and I got my ass beat, and I got physically up, and sometimes some sexual shit happened, and yeah, like I wasn't rape, but rape-ish.
That doesn't really sound like the premise for a family-friendly sitcom, and I think it's something that really needs to be kept in mind when watching this show. There's an interesting excerpt from an essay titled Anti-Blackness and Colorblindness in Post-Cosby Sitcoms, Likeable Black Teachers, Exceptional Black Students, and Everybody Hates Chris by Amir Asim Gilmore. Black students are told that schooling is not suffering, as it is an opportunity to better your life, but then are forced to endure the daily onslaught of anti-blackness. If they do not succeed, Black students are told they did not take advantage of school, that they are lazy, or that they lack the ability to succeed. Under the guise of meritocracy and racial progress, there is a fondness to dismiss Black suffering because it is presumed to only occur in the past. Without examining the current experiences of Black students, Black suffering becomes mundane. It becomes assumed. It becomes invisible. Black suffering is so ever-present that a Black person watching Rock's humorous schooling experience could say to oneself, "This was me." Everybody Hates Chris shouldn't be confused with a documentary, and there's no reason a funny show can't try to find humor in a difficult experience, especially when the story is coming from the person who experienced it. The people who lived through this experience are very much still around. It isn't as simple as observing the racism on the show and dismissing it as something that happened in the past and that things are better now. Even if they have improved, a childhood like the one we see Chris experience on the show isn't something you shrug off as you get older. Everybody Hates Chris is describing a problem in schooling that has a legacy in the present. On May 8th, 2009, Everybody Hates Chris came to an end with the episode Everybody Hates the GED. The series brings to a head Chris's constant struggles at school. After a long record of late arrivals, Chris is told he'll have to repeat the 10th grade if he's late one more time. Considering the distance he has to travel, it's no surprise that this happens again in very short order. So instead of repeating the 10th grade, Chris decides he will drop out of school and get a GED.
Ma, a lot of people got their GED and did fine. I looked it up.
Yeah, like who?
Bill Cosby got GED.
So what? You want to be a comedian? Ha! Very funny.
In real life, Chris Rock did drop out of high school and instead got his GED, so we're seeing the series catch up to that part of his past. That's one of the indicators that the show wouldn't be continuing for much longer.
I used to always tell the people at the network, I said, the day this kid walks into a comedy club, the show's over. Because that's when he begins the journey as the guy that we know.
The episode ends with a final scene of the family at a diner. Chris is awaiting the results of his test, and it's all very clearly meant to be a parody of the final scene of The Sopranos, only with Bon Jovi being played on the jukebox instead of Journey. Sadly, thanks to YouTube's copyright system, you'll all have to imagine Living on a Prayer playing while looking at these clips. As Julius arrives with the test results, we get the final line of the series.
What's it say?
I think leaving us with the question of Chris getting his GED or not reflects the uncertainty anyone in his shoes would feel about their life in general. How many more moments in life will be like this? Is it all just one long cliffhanger while you hope for the best while rocking out to Bon Jovi? There are worse fates if that's what's on the jukebox. What we can be certain of is that, after 4 years of abuse, Chris has decided to opt out of the school system and instead work outside of it. It's a daring move and one that provides an answer about how to survive in an unjust world, that sometimes you have to figure out how to operate outside of a system that harms you. If the series can be understood about growing up and finding one's path in life, I think it's neat that Chris's path is one he decides to carve for himself rather than the painful one someone chose for him. This really brought to a head a lot of the themes and ideas of this series, of Chris growing up, again, not just taking on responsibilities, but understanding the adults in his life as more complicated human beings, particularly ones that can sometimes make mistakes, and that the path charted for you isn't necessarily the one you must walk down. This isn't to say that graduating high school is a bad thing, of course. For most people, it's almost certainly the right path, but Chris's situation called for a drastic step. He was facing a lot of very unique abuse, and the lesson is less about the specific institution of high school and more about how institutions more broadly can fail people, forcing those who are failed to work around them. Although it seemed like such a fitting end to the series, the cast actually didn't know that the show is ending while filming that last episode.
I love the show. I love what's going on. I'm going to miss the 4th season. I pray we'll be back.
Pretty sad day. There's a lot of see you when I see you type of things going on because nobody likes to say goodbye. And hello just doesn't make sense when you're leaving. Hopefully you'll see us again for another season. If not, it's been a fun ride. Thanks.
An article published after the finale aired read, with appearances by many of the show's recurring characters, Chris dropping out of school and the not-so-subtle homage to the finale of The Sopranos, Chris Rock intends this to be the series finale. The show is very likely to be canceled due to a variety of reasons, and the comedian decided to make it an easy decision for the network. Terry Crews says, Chris Rock didn't graduate high school and started comedy when he was like 17 years old. Our Chris is now a sophomore in high school, so the timing is lining up pretty well. Once he becomes a comedian, the show's over. Tyler James Williams is currently pursuing a film course at New York University and is happy with the episode. He told TV Guide, "If it ends here, we ended it the right way." Rock agrees and said, "It might not be a bad way to go." Although this wasn't the last we heard from Chris and his family, it would be the last we see of them for a long time.
It's like the last day of school and people go off and do their separate things and go their separate ways, but I'm out this bitch.
Everybody hates
On September 25th, 2024, we got the debut of the new animated series, Everybody Still Hates Chris. Although all the kids were recast, Terry Crews and Tashina Arnold reprised their roles, along with a number of other actors who made up the residents of Bed-Stuy. It picks up immediately where the live-action series left off.
You failed.
What?
Boy, I'ma slap you in the animation.
Ow.
And so Chris is back at school, thankfully not having to repeat the 10th grade, so he and Greg can remain friends and the show can resume from where it left off. Funny how that all worked out. The animated series is not a subtle show, even less so than its predecessor. For example, if you consider the type of racism Chris faces in the outside world, particularly in white neighborhoods, it's presented very obviously in the live-action series.
What are you doing, huh? Yeah, forget about it. Little watermelon, keep walking.
In the animated series, though, they go straight to having him run into members of the Ku Klux Klan.
You lost? That's what the Native Americans said when you showed up.
The episode does go on to have an interesting discussion about how Black parents have to prepare their kids for racism out in the world. But it also tempers that with how you can't let fear control you so much that you're afraid to step out into that world. It's a pretty good episode, and the series looks to be off to a good start. It's only 10 episodes in, though, so we'll see how it shapes up in the future. During a press conference for the animated series, we did get some interesting thoughts about the original show.
I told Terry years ago when we were doing it, I said, this show, everybody's going to love this show and they're going to miss it when it's gone. And that's exactly what happened.
And it would be criminal if I didn't mention the part of the world where they miss it the most.
That support is worldwide.
Yes, Brazil.
One thing that...
Shout out to Brazil.
Yes. Te amo.
Everybody Hates Chris is an enormous hit in Brazil. Here's Tashina Arnold talking about why she thinks that's the case.
They told me that I was one of the only positive Black female dark-skinned images on in Brazil. Because,
do you go to Brazil often?
I've been there 4 times.
Oh, wow. That's pretty. Yeah. Why do you go there so often?
Because I'm a star there.
Terry Crews also expressed his appreciation by speaking Portuguese.
Oi, gente. Te amo, Brasil. Obrigado por apoiar Everybody Hates Chris e Brooklyn 99. Até próxima!
Tyler James Williams had a fun moment on The Rich Eisen Show where he demonstrated how his Instagram would get flooded with comments in Portuguese.
And listen, I love Brazil. You guys are wonderful.
What
it's
does
great.
Pai do Greg
I don't know, man. I just don't know. It's so
just
confusing.
cursed in Portuguese. I'd be careful.
You might have just cursed.
They're asking if Rich Eisen is Greg's father. Brazil loves the show. I can't speak to why exactly, as I'm not Brazilian and my Portuguese isn't strong enough, so maybe some enterprising Brazilian person watching this can make that video. but I wanted to at least acknowledge their enormous love for the series. If you're looking to watch Everybody Hates Chris today, at least in English, you have to be careful where you find it. Due to what I assume were licensing issues, some streaming platforms have altered the music in certain episodes, notably in the first season. So instead of getting hits from the 80s, you get these generic replacements. Making it even worse is that the replacement music can often be so loud that it ruins the audio mix of the episode and makes it tough to hear the dialogue. Here's a comparison between the two versions. The comparison might be a little abbreviated to avoid a copyright claim.
Mama, can we get these?
No.
Mama, can we get these?
No.
In addition to dialogue being overwhelmed by music, there were also entire chunks cut out of episodes, like when characters sing popular songs.
It's like the jungle sometimes, it makes me wonder how I keep from going under. Ha 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 ha.
If you're wondering which version you're listening to, the first episode should sound like this when it begins.
1982.
Following the end of the series, Tyler James Williams would go on to appear in Let It Shine, Dear White People, and The Walking Dead. Most recently, he has taken on the role of Gregory in the ABC sitcom Abbott Elementary, where he earned an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Comedy Series. Terry Crews would go from Everybody Hates Chris to working with Ali Leroy again on the series Are We There Yet? From there, he would join the cast of Brooklyn Nine-Nine for 8 seasons. He's also appeared in the Expendables movies, Deadpool 2, and many other movies. Tachina Arnold went on to appear in the TV series Happily Divorced, Survivor's Remorse, and most recently over 8 seasons on The Neighborhood. She's also appeared in several movies, including Countdown and The Last Black Man in San Francisco. Daquan Richmond would go on to appear in the movie Blue Caprice, and he has had recurring roles on General Hospital and the TV series version of Boomerang. Imani Hakim had several roles following the show, including being on Mythic Quest and Cam. Most recently, she was part of the English language dub for Pokémon Concierge. Vincent Martella has largely done voice work after the show ended, particularly in the roles of Phineas Flynn on Phineas and Ferb, Hope in the Final Fantasy XIII games, and Jason Todd in 2 animated Batman movies. Everybody Hates Chris had a brief run, but had it come at a different time and perhaps on a different channel, it might have had a better chance at finding long-term success. The revival via cartoon shows that there's an audience that was hoping to see more, though it remains to be seen how long that particular incarnation of the show will run for. The feeling that the show wasn't appreciated at the time is shared by Tyler James Williams. In an interview, he said, "You saw with Everybody Hates Chris. We got nominated for the Golden Globe with season 1, but we were the black show that was nominated. We weren't considered one of the elite shows at the time. We suffered after the fact because of that." Had it had the chance to really build an audience and achieve some ratings magic, Everybody Hates Chris might have been more appreciated at the time. But instead it was placed in this special box very few shows can break out of. This is the fate a lot of shows starring predominantly black casts face. In the case of Everybody Hates Chris, being passed over by Fox and going to UPN was a challenge, but it managed to be the second most popular show on that channel. Then when it was on the UW, it bounced around time slots, but still managed to perform well enough to make it to 4 seasons. You can't really say it had the same opportunities as other sitcoms, but its ability to achieve in the face of all those circumstances really reminds you of Chris's own journey and how he was able to make a life for himself, even though he faced some pretty tough odds while going through school and living in Bed-Stuy. The fact that Everybody Hates Chris is still remembered today is a testament to the quality it achieved and the connection it made with its audience. As someone who never watched Everybody Hates Chris when it originally aired, I was really looking forward to watching it for the first time, and it did not disappoint. This was a really fun series to watch. I was a little sad it only lasted for 4 seasons, but because of that, maybe it was able to keep up its quality in a way that other shows that went on for significantly longer seemed to suffer from when those later seasons rolled around. I highly recommend checking it out, especially since it's not a very long-term investment. But while we're in the midst of recommending things, you might want to check out some other videos on my channel, such as my other deep dives into sitcoms and TV shows from the past. Maybe you'll like those videos enough that you'll want to support this channel financially, like the fine names you see going up the screen right now. Patrons and channel members get early access to videos, their name in the credits of course, and other fun bonuses I throw in every now and again. Those bonuses include things like deleted scenes and extended versions of videos that otherwise wouldn't really work on the main channel. If you would like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. Thank you all so much for watching.